Hi guys. So a couple things before we get started. One, you should have joined Zoom for attendance. If you have not joined Zoom yet, you need to go do that so I can mark you as present. Second thing, this is how today's gonna go. I'm going to keep the Zoom open if you have any questions, but your main focus is to watch this video and take notes. I've given you in that Google Classroom post a list of people that you should be writing notes for. We will have an open notes quiz tomorrow. So you can use your notes on the quiz. So I would take as many notes as possible with this lecture. I'm not going to really have any notes up. I'm just going to talk to you verbally. So you can pause the video at any time. That's kind of why I did it, in case I'm talking too fast or too slow. Just go at your own pace. Make sure you are taking notes over every single one of those names of those people that we're going to talk about today. And at the end of class, by the end of class, you should send me your notes, either a picture of it or share it with me on Google Classroom. Either one works. Just email that to me by the end of the class period. So this shouldn't really take you very long, especially if you get a jump on things. So to review, check in on Zoom for attendance. Watch this video and take notes over the names that I posted in Google Classroom, and send those notes to me by the end of this class period, not the end of the day, by the end of the class period. So let's get started. First woman we're going to talk about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What a queen. First of all, we're going to talk about many queens today, but this is our very first one. She started the women's movement. She was officially the one to start the women's movement. And she was president of the National American Suffrage Association, also known as NAWSA, for over 20 years. And a really interesting thing about her is that when she got married, before all this, right, before she got married, the language in the ceremony, the woman would have to say, I vow to obey my husband. And she actually got rid of that language because she saw marriage as a partnership, and which I think is pretty cool. She also wrote what's called the Women's Bible, meaning that she went through the Bible and kind of took out any instance where women were oppressed or enslaved, which is pretty cool. But really what you need to write down, hint, hint, is that she officially started the women's movement, and she was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, for 20 years. Our next queen is Carrie Chapman Cat. Mr. Snow calls her Triple C. An interesting story about her is that when she was younger, she saw her dad going to vote, and she asked her mom, "Hey, are you going with her? Are you going with dad to go vote?" And they both just started laughing at her. And that experience really stuck with her. She was really confused, especially at a young age, why her mom couldn't go to vote and why her parents were laughing at the idea of a woman voting. But an important thing to write down is that she came up with the winning plan. And what that plan was is that she thought that they shouldn't try for the amendment right away, right? The amendment for the right to vote. What they needed to do, and what her plan was, is to go from state to state to state to state until she got 36 individual states to allow women to vote. And then with that momentum, right, with 36 states backing, then they could push for the amendment. So that was her winning plan. Our next person is Susan B. Anthony. You've probably heard of her. She's one of the most recognized leaders of the movement. She actually founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. But what's important about her is that not only did she found that association, she also wrote the 19th Amendment, which is the actual amendment that went into place, right? But unfortunately, she died 14 years before women were given the right to vote. But she actually is the author of the 19th Amendment. Next one is Dr. Mabel P. Lee. She was born around, born in 1897 in China, and she actually moved to the United States at age 4, so she was an immigrant. But what's really amazing and important about her is that at age 16 years old, she led over 10,000 people in the New York suffrage parade, which I think is pretty cool. It's more than cool, it's amazing. At 16 years old to lead that many people fighting for women's rights at age 16 is amazing. She was the first Chinese woman to get her PhD, her doctorate in economics. And she was often written about in the New York Tribune and the New York Times for her activism. It's important to know that like women of color didn't gain really the right to vote at the same time as white women. It took 25 years after the 19th Amendment was passed for Lee and other women of color that we'll talk about later to gain the right to vote. And it's unfortunate because it's unknown if she ever became a citizen and actually got to exercise her right to vote later. So, but she definitely was huge in ensuring that many other women of color gained the right to vote. Our next woman is Ida B. Wells. She was a journalist, activist, researcher. She was actually born into slavery during the Civil War. And an interesting story about her, she was thrown off of a train car, even though she had bought a first-class ticket. And she actually took the case to court and she won at the local level, but unfortunately it was overturned at the federal level. And the death threats that she received from this court case were so bad, she had to move from her home in Memphis to Chicago. But what's important about her is that she was a huge activist in against white mob violence and really investigated lynching. She actually wrote her findings and published them. And another big thing about her is that she was confronting white women in the suffrage movement that were denying and not focusing or ignoring lynching. And she was often ridiculed and ostracized in the women's suffrage movement and by organizations in the suffrage movement. But nevertheless, Ida B. Wells, she remained active in the movement and continued her activism. Mary Mcleod Bethune, she was an educator in the civil rights and women's movement. And she was born to parents that were enslaved. But what's really, really important and cool about her is that in college, she actually founded a lot of educational standards for Black colleges. And she was an advisor to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who made her an advocate for education. And she actually was leading voter registration drives in 1920, which is a really, really risky time to be doing that, especially for women. So that is Mary. Then we have Alice Paul. Let me just take a second, because Alice Paul is quite possibly the coolest woman in the movement. Not that the other women aren't cool, but let me just share what she did. Okay. She was a huge leader in the movement. She actually at one point was protesting in front of the White House. So well, I'll show you a picture, I think next week when we talk about like the movement as a whole, but she's protesting in front of the White House. Instead of letting them do that, right, among other women, she was with other women, instead of just letting them do that and saying, okay, it's their right to free speech, police officers actually arrest all of the women, including Alice Paul, and they throw them in jail. But in jail, she does not give up. No, no, no. Alice Paul actually organizes a hunger strike while she is in prison. And if you don't know what a hunger strike means, it basically is what it says. They are protesting by not eating. So after a while, the officers and the guards actually try and force feed her. And they throw her in an insane asylum, and later in solitary confinement to try and break her will, but that doesn't work because she's awesome. So that's just kind of, she's very like a go-getter, and will do pretty much anything except give up. So she's amazing. Then we have Zitka Laza. She is a Native American voting rights activist, and she grew up in Yankton, South Dakota. When she was younger, she was forced to go to a boarding school for Native American children. We learned about those last semester. Pretty terrible, awful, disgusting conditions. She often described the misery of the school's attempts to erase her heritage, and she would contrast that with the joy she felt in learning to read and write. So she was really happy about learning to read and write, but again, the misery and the pain of those boarding schools trying to squeeze out the last of their Native American heritage is just appalling. And she wrote about that as well. She later became a music teacher at a similar boarding school, but finally quit because she just couldn't stand to watch what the schools were doing to Native American children. And she later went on to be a huge activist in fighting against the cruelty of assimilation, remember that word? Assimilation tactics in Native American boarding schools. And then our last queen for today is Adelina Otera Warren. She is the first Hispanic woman to run for United States Congress. She's also the first female superintendent of public schools in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And she was a huge leader in New Mexico for the suffrage movement. One of the more important things to know about her is that she advocated that suffrage materials be published in both English and Spanish. So that really made these materials, meaning like pamphlets and information about the suffrage movement, accessible to non-English speakers. She also served as Santa Fe's County Inspector of Native American Schools. So she was also a huge activist against assimilation tactics and the treatment of Native American children in those boarding schools. Criticized their poor conditions, argued that they threatened family and cultural stability. So there are the queens of some of the queens of the women's movement. Again, make sure that you are sending those notes to me via email by the end of the class period. And if you have any questions, I'll be on Zoom right now. So I'll see you over there. All right. Smell you later.